William James is one of the principal figures in modern Anglo-American philosophy. The philosophic movement that he was the leader of, pragmatism, is certainly one of the most important and indeed enduring philosophical projects of the last 100 years. The contemporary philosopher Richard Rorty has argued that, in fact, if one looks at trends not only in Anglo-American, but in continental philosophy as well, one will find that James is not so much the beginning of the road, but the end of the road. That when the Derridas and Foucaults, as well as the Davidsons and Quines, take their next 2 steps forward in their movements, they'll wind up just where James began. That's a rather bold claim. I want to try and instantiate it in a couple cases throughout the text, or the discussion rather, of the text of pragmatism. But I would say first that perhaps the best way of getting an angle on James is to see him as, in many ways he is, the American Nietzsche. Or better yet, James' pragmatism is the American version of Nietzschean perspectivalism. This is, I think, a more apt comparison than most scholars have previously seen. For one, they shared many of the same influences, they had many common interests, and they also shared a lot of views about philosophy, truth, and metaphysics. Both were profoundly influenced by the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, by the idealistic and romantic movements of the early 19th century, and perhaps most importantly, both were struck powerfully by the Darwinian Revolution. And finally, of course, I think a very important similarity and influence, neither of them has a technical philosophic training. Nietzsche, you'll remember, was a philologist, trained in classical languages, and James was a doctor, trained at Harvard Medical School, who became one of the founders of modern experimental psychology. Psychology, of course, is the principal interest they share in common as well. We'll remember from Nietzsche, each conceived of himself as a philosophical psychologist, which is to say, Nietzsche thought that what one did was to look at psychological states and see what sort of philosophical implications one could draw from them. James, in a way, could then be said to be a psychological philosopher. He did just the opposite of Nietzsche. What he did is said, let us look at philosophical systems and see if we can read into them certain psychological attitudes, propensities, dispositions. And of course, he did this in 2 very famous texts. The Principles of Psychology, which is one of the standard texts for experimental psychology, and of course his famous Varieties of Religious Experience, another common shared interest with Nietzsche, that of religious psychology. Now, as to their views, both were perspectivalists. Both share an external perspectivalism, the view that reality is in some sense unfixed, an internal perspectivalism, that the self itself is a posit. Both shared a certain amount of anti-realism, that the world does not necessarily correspond to our best descriptions of it. Both looked at truth and culture not as a copy, not as an artifact, but as a tool for life. And both, of course, perhaps most famously, saw metaphysics as largely hanging on spiritual consolation and the projection of internal psychological needs and states. Well, given all that similarity, there is nonetheless a sharp difference. James puts what I would call an American spin on perspectivalism. He celebrates tolerance, openness, democratic egalitarianism, in sharp contrast to Nietzsche's morbid fascination with cruelty, elitism, and what we must call, I think, a snobbish contempt for the herd. And in fact, I think you find this different sense, this different spin, as it were, in the different idioms they use to describe the same sorts of phenomena. What Nietzsche calls perspectivalism, James calls pragmatism, pragmatism coming from the Greek word for practice or action, where Nietzsche says that culture, truth, is all about the power principle, right? We determine what to believe on the basis of how it empowers us. James, ever the American, says that rather than a power principle, that is in fact the ideas or beliefs cash value. It's what you can purchase with it. And indeed, we might use the term purchase or hold on reality with respect to culture in the exact same place as Nietzsche uses the expression domination. And whereas Nietzsche would argue that truth, since there is no correspondence, is a lie or useful error, James says that truth, rather than a lie or useful error, is serviceable or helpful. In short, they both look at the same perspectival truth. Nietzsche, the continental thinker, brought up in a tradition of rationalism, can't help in seeing the loss of absolute truth, a certain amount of, how should we say, the glass being half empty. James, on the other hand, seeing how serviceable even unabsolute truths are to human needs, sees the glass as half full. Well, from the American perspective, right, adopting our view, James' pragmatism is then, I would urge, a mature, adult form of Nietzsche's adolescent insight, and it would run as follows. Unlike Nietzsche, James is no longer scandalized by the loss of absolute truth, by the inability to gain what we might call a God's eye view of things. Instead of Nietzsche's implication from such a lack of God's eye view that we must therefore veer towards ruthlessness and recklessness, James says just the opposite. Precisely because there is no absolute truth, we have to be doubly careful, doubly cautious, and doubly calculative in our warrantable beliefs. Okay, enough contrast to Nietzsche. Let me then turn to what I would call the democratic ethos of pragmatism. And I think it's nowhere better exemplified than in the rhetoric of the text itself. Pragmatism was a series of lectures, first given in 1906 at the Lowell Institute in Boston, and then offered the following year at Columbia University in New York. The audience, and I think this is important, included a large number of laypersons, amateurs, as well as professional philosophers. I mention this because, contrary to most of the other texts we find in the history of philosophy, pragmatism is not pitched to the professional. James makes a self-conscious decision to pitch it to the amateurs in the audience. And it is for that reason that the text of pragmatism is perhaps one of the most accessible and pleasant works in 20th century philosophy. Now, this strategy of pitching to the average person, certainly led to a large degree of what I would call derision and criticism from the academy. But James believed that it was the average person who should ultimately be the philosophic authority. I quote, "The finally victorious way of looking at things will be the most completely impressive way to the normal run of minds." So it was a very self-conscious strategy James took, and I'm going to take advantage of that in presenting the text by occasionally quoting passages from James to give you a sense of the very open and attractive prose and rhetoric that James employs. James opened his discussion with a lecture quite scandalously entitled "The Present Dilemma in Philosophy." James interprets the long-standing philosophical dispute between what we've been calling in the series the rationalist or German idealist tradition on the one hand and the empiricist or positivist tradition on the other as a clash between two different temperaments. Temperaments which he calls tender-minded and tough-minded respectively. Right? We know the tender-minded sort of worldview. They tend to be rationalistic. They go by principles, right? Principles first, a priori truths. They tend to be intellectualistic. You judge a theory whether it appeals to the rational faculties of our cognitive makeup. They're idealistic, right? They tend to think that ideas are abstract entities which have a reality above and beyond the physical world. They're optimistic. They consistently argue that this is, in fact, the best of all possible worlds if only we can attain the absolute perspective. They're religious. The absolute is, in fact, a sort of secularized version of God. They're free willist, as James calls them, believing that human dignity demands that we be autonomous from the sort of causal, psychological events that occur in other animals. They're monistic. Reality is one, it's unified. And of course, as we've seen with Hume, they're intensely dogmatic. On the other side, we find the tough-minded philosophers, people like Hume, Locke, Berkeley. They're empiricists. For them, it's only the facts that count. They're sensationalistic. They don't appeal to your rational faculties. They appeal to your sense datum, your experience. They're materialistic, right? With the exception of Berkeley, they tend to believe that the world is made up of matter or atoms in the void. They're pessimistic. They offer you no grounds for hope. They're irreligious. They're skeptical about the belief in a God. They're fatalistic, knowing fully well that if the material principle is correct, the universe will eventually go out of being. They're pluralistic, failing to see how the world is unified, instead noticing facts, seeing the diversity of things. And of course, they're skeptical, refusing to make strong statements. Now that's a very nice sort of tabular description of, say, the last 500 years of Western philosophy, but note what that implies to open a lecture with such a table. It is in fact, is it not, demystifying, debunking all of the philosophic tradition. Whereas Nietzsche's perspectivalism was a sort of shock therapy, as I argued, a sort of tough love for the average person. James' pragmatism, in this case at least, is tough love for philosophers. You must come to realize that your texts are nothing so much as the expression of your personalities. As he states, the books of all the great philosophers are like so many men. Our sense of an essential personal flavor in each one of them, typical but indescribable, is the finest fruit of our own accomplished philosophic education. What the system pretends to be is a picture of the great universe of God. What it is, and oh so flagrantly, is the revelation of how intensely odd the personal flavor of some fellow creature is. And that, I would urge, is an incredibly deflationary view of philosophy. Right? What do most of you take away from any of these lectures but the sense of what an odd egg Hegel was? Strange fellow, that Spinoza and that Berkeley. And his point is that the layman who takes that view away should not be critiqued as being a philosophic lowbrow, but is in fact making the natural, intelligent response to the facts. Well, James also points out that very few of us are likely to fall into one camp or the other. Only a philosopher makes consistency into such a virtue. And that then constitutes our dilemma. We have on the one hand the tender-minded, and they have their virtues. They're inspiring, they offer a cosmological promise, hope of a better world, but at the cost of what Nietzsche would call one's intellectual conscience. Right? They give you hope, they give you aspiration, but only by forcing yourself to become a scientific illiterate. On the other hand, you have the tough-minded, right? They preserve your intellectual conscience. They don't say anything that would make you blush. On the other hand, they're intensely fatalistic, they're irreligious, they're pessimistic, and of course, for some people at least, that leads to depression, psychological ennui. The rational person, James says, naturally wants the good things on both sides of the table, right? And I wish to quote James here. Most of us have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line. Facts are good, of course. Give us lots of facts. Principles are good. Give us plenty of principles. The world's undoubtedly one if you look at it one way, but as indubitably it is many if you look at it in another way. Everything, of course, is necessarily determined, and yet, of course, our wills are free. A sort of free will determinism is the true philosophy. And James is making a good point here. All of these things have value for our lives, right? Optimism, aspiration, as well as a certain sense of fact, a certain sense of the subtleties of particular existence. Well, that's where pragmatism enters. James promises in his first lecture that pragmatism is the philosophy which will allow you to have your cake and eat it too. It is at this point that my own solution begins to appear. I offer the oddly named thing pragmatism as a philosophy that can satisfy both kinds of demand. It can remain religious, like the rationalisms, but at the same time, like the empiricists, it can preserve the richest intimacy with facts. Okay, for James, pragmatism is both a method and a theory of truth. The method grows out of Charles Saunders Peirce's pragmatic account of meaning. Now, Peirce's account ran something as follows. The meaning of an expression is determined by the experiences or consequences that would follow or would ensue if, and under certain conditions, if and only if that expression were the case or were true. All right? In short, pragmatism asks this question as a method. What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion rather than that notion were true? If no practical difference whatever can be traced, then the alternative means practically the same thing and all dispute is idle. Okay? That's the pragmatic notion of meaning. And we'll find that that is, of course, an important tenet in logical positivism in A.J. Ayer. James generalized this doctrine into a larger method for settling metaphysical disputes, and, in addition, interpreting philosophical doctrines. Such views and doctrines, and by the way, James, like Nietzsche, refused to draw a sharp line between metaphysics and science, so even scientific theories are instruments of action and not fixed and final answers to problems posed by the world. As James says, the whole function of philosophy ought to be to find out what difference, what definite difference it will make to you and me, a definite instance of our life, if this world formula or that world formula be the true one. What hangs on materialism or spiritualism or free will or determinism? And we will return to that, but first I want to talk about the pragmatic theory of truth, at least briefly. James points out that this theory was developed in large part with the collaboration of C.S.F. Schiller and John Dewey. It is, as James describes it, a genetic theory of truth, where truth is something that happens to an idea or a belief. We invent new truths to cope with anomalous experiences, and such invention is limited by the desire to change as few of our old beliefs as follows, or as possible, rather. As James puts it, the individual has a stock of old opinions already, but he meets a new experience that puts them to a strain. The result is an inward trouble to which his mind, till then, had been a stranger, and from which he seeks to escape by modifying his previous mass of opinions. At least some new idea comes up which he can graft upon the ancient stock with a minimum of disturbance of the latter. Some idea that mediates between the stock and the new experience and runs them into one another most felicitously and expediently. This new idea is then adopted as the true one. And James offers an example in the lecture itself. Imagine, as it were, if I was to, in the midst of my lecture, start singing at the top of my lungs, "It's my party, and I'll cry if I want to," in the midst of loud shrieking and sobs and tears. Well, that would be an anomalous experience, right? I haven't done that in any of the previous lectures. So far, I've been, I hope, admirably lucid. So you might have to try and come up with a new truth to account for that. You might say, well, whatever did he have for lunch? Did he have those pork chops that look a little undercooked and green? That might explain it. But if you couldn't find something like that, you might say, well, does he have a previous history of doing this? And you would keep searching until you found an explanation that made you give up as little of your beliefs as possible. What you want to do, of course, is find some way of accounting for my auditory ejaculation without concluding that I'm insane. This is a view which, in about 60 years after this text, Willard Quine will describe as a web of belief or field of force, and will be considered one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. Again, I'm trying to cash in, as it were, Rorty's point about James. So true beliefs, then, are those that effectively marry the new experience to the old stock of truths or common sense. And as James quite aptly puts it, the true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good, too, for definite, assignable reasons. Okay, let's return to the pragmatic method, because James applies it to several long-standing metaphysical disputes and problems. But first I want to begin with an illustration he offers from an experience he had while camping, because I think it's very illustrative not only of his rhetoric, but also of some of his views. He was camping, he says, with some of his friends, and he went off on a nature trail and came back, and his friends were in the midst of a heated metaphysical struggle. They said, imagine a fellow chasing a squirrel around a tree. The squirrel, of course, is faster than him, so he can never actually catch the squirrel. The squirrel always keeps the tree between himself and the person. Then the question becomes, does the man go round the squirrel, or does he not? And the group had apparently broken into about even camps. And since James was the deciding vote, they both appealed to him. And James offered them this answer. He said, well, doesn't it really hang on what you mean by going round? If you mean by going round that he's on each of the compass points, north, west, south, east, respectively, of the squirrel, well, then he certainly does go round the squirrel. If, however, you mean by going round the squirrel, that he's first at the side of the squirrel, and then at the back of the squirrel, and at the other side, and then in front, then he clearly doesn't go round. And while a couple of his friends said, well, that's philosophical hogwash, most of his companions accepted it. The reason I bring it up is, first it shows us what did that distinction, what did that struggle hang on? It hung on the way we choose to cash the expression go round into experience. And look at the way James resolves it. He resolves it pluralistically. There is no right one answer. If going round as circling the compass points works for you and gets you through your experiences with squirrels, then that's fine. And if the other one works just as well, then that's just as fine. I point this out because James thought that pluralism was perhaps more than any other philosophic view the best insight of the sort of thinker you have. A thinker who could accept pluralism, that there is not one absolute truth, that there might be more than one right way or best way to describe a problem. For James is at the cutting edge of the pragmatic revolution. Okay, now that you have a sense of the method, let's watch as James applies it to particular cases. The first case is the long-standing struggle between materialism and spiritualism. Is it just atoms in the void, or are we souls and spirits with an oversoul? James points something out. If we look at this in a retrodictive sense, if we look back in time, you can't tell any difference. Imagine the world ends at this moment, and we look back at all of human history, natural history, cosmic history, universal history. What difference would it make? Can spiritualism, can the providence of God account for everything that's happened? Certainly. Perhaps not to everyone's satisfaction, but it certainly can logically and coherently. Similarly, atoms in the void. The argument that the universe is just matter and energy going through its changes and developments can account for everything that's happened to date. So if we look from the past to the present, there is no difference whatsoever between materialism and spiritualism. However, prospectively, it's an entirely different kettle of fish, as it were. Materialism teaches us, right, that one day the sun will supernova. The planet will die. The universe will collapse. All of our aspirations, our projects, our goals, our achievements will have meant nothing. And they will be permanently obliterated without a trace, without a memory, all for naught. Spiritualism, on the other hand, gives us ground to hope that something in some way may persist, even if the universe goes out of being, at least perhaps in the mind of God. Our achievements, our aspirations may exist as examples, or at least as exemplars. And I quote James, "Here then lie the real meanings of materialism and spiritualism, not in the hair-splitting abstractions about matter's inner essence, or about the metaphysical attributes of God. Materialism means simply the denial that the moral order is eternal, and the cutting off of ultimate hopes. Spiritualism means the affirmation of an eternal moral order, and the letting loose of hope. Surely here is an issue genuine enough." Note something. James has not settled the issue. He simply said what it hangs on. James is a pluralist. If you need that sort of cosmological hope, well, then who could deny you your spiritualism, as long as it doesn't do too much violence to your old stock of beliefs, right? Conservatism always being the primary directive in keeping our web of beliefs solid. Similarly, if you don't have those needs, then you have no need for spiritualism. Materialism will fulfill you. Well, let's turn now to the dispute between free will and determinism. James points out that many philosophers have tried to be pragmatic by trying to hang the issue on culpability and punishment. Right? We've discovered if we're not really free, if we're determined to act, how can I be blamed for anything I do? And of course, the determinists respond, if you are free and your acts are spontaneous, then there's no reason to think they'll recur. One murder might not lead to another. Why would we punish you except out of vengeance? James finds that whole argument somewhere between amusing and despicable. It's absolutely absurd. As he states, instinct and utility are more than sufficient to dictate our moral actions of praise and blame. And he's making a very good point here. When you have a moral, or better yet, criminal problem, do you go to a philosophy department and find a philosopher? Or do you look for a policeman and take the guy to court? Philosophers don't settle such issues. Juries do. Lawyers do. Judges do. Policemen do. Right? Free will and determinism, therefore, do not at all hang on the issue of culpability, nor do they have any difference with respect to human history in the past tense. Right? Everything that's happened in the human past can be accounted for on the basis of human freedom. We saw Hegel do that. Or it can be done on a materialist basis. We've seen Marx and Weber attempt to do that on a completely deterministic basis. Where then is the difference? Again, it's with the future. For some people, determinism means that the future will resemble the past. And James says that there are certain people who are melancholic. James himself was. Or as he would say, unhealthy souls. Souls which are, as he would argue, deeper. And for them, this notion that the future will resemble the past, will be just like it, is a cause of despair. Most of the human past has been suffering, has been silliness, if not stupidity and cupidity and venality. On the other hand, what does free will teach us? Free will pragmatically means that we can expect novelties in the future. Right? It means the right to expect that in its deepest elements, as well as in its surface phenomena, the future may not identically repeat and imitate the past. It holds up improvement as at least possible, whereas determinism assures us that our whole notion of possibility is born of human ignorance. It's therefore possible, if we believe in free will, pragmatically, that the world can be made better, a doctrine James called meliorism, which he contrasted to both optimism, the rationalistic view that this is the best of all possible worlds and it's going to work out in the wash, and pessimism, that we're destined to make the same stupid mistakes we made before again. James' point is, there is contingency. There is at least the possibility, if one accepts free will as a pragmatic hypothesis rather than a metaphysical dogma, that we could make the world better. Nothing stops us from doing so. Finally, I turn to the doctrine of God or design. And again, it has no retrodictive force. Right? The world could have occurred as a result of God and his providential design, or it could have occurred by the action of atoms in the void. But it does have a perspective difference, doesn't it? Right? If it is the case that there is no design, then any moral improvement or physical improvement in the world will hang entirely on our efforts. And that, James says, causes no small degree of anxiety in sensitive souls. One is constantly, as it were, in a moral uproar, trying to make things better and work towards a better future. But look at what God and design offer. They assure us that everything will work out in the wash, right? That God is up in his heaven, and eventually it'll all be okay. What then is the pragmatic cash value of God or design? It gives us the excuse to take the occasional moral holiday. Say, okay, I've done enough moral behavior for the day. I can take the rest of the day off because God's going to make sure it works out in the end. And he says, and I think quite sensibly so, to deny God is to say that one ought never take a moral holiday, that one ought never check one's moral projects at the door and relax for a little while. And yet, that is an important part of life, isn't it? Part of the pleasant part of life is occasionally relaxing from our moral struggles. So all of these issues in religious metaphysics come down to what for James? They come down, or as he says, arise in the fact that our empirical future feels to us unsafe and needs some higher guarantee. And note the difference between him and Nietzsche here. Nietzsche says the exact same thing and says that's despicable. Humans are acting weak when they grab for such a crutch. Whereas James is saying, no, look at the animal. The animal has this need. Who is to say that that need is inauthentic? If it helps it survive, and it certainly has for the last several millennia, then who could deny it? Then what makes that irrational? It's biological. So James concludes in his discussion of metaphysical disputes that pragmatism represents a philosophical, what he calls Protestant Reformation, what I would call a rebellion against authority on behalf of the individual. Whereas Nietzsche located that moment in the gay cyber, the gay science of the chivalrous troubadour knights of Provence. James the Protestant sees that same activity in the Protestant Reformation, and this might well count as his manifesto. The earth of things, long thrown into shadows by the glories of the upper ether, Plato's heaven, must resume its place. To shift the emphasis in this way means that philosophic questions will fall to be treated by minds of a less abstractionist type. Minds more scientific and individualistic in their tone, yet not irreligious either. It will be an alteration in the seat of authority that reminds one almost of the Protestant Reformation. And as to papal minds, the Protestantism has often seemed a mere mess of anarchy and confusion. Such, no doubt, will pragmatism seem to ultra-rationalistic minds in philosophy. It will seem so much mere trash, philosophically. But life wags on, all the same, and compasses its ends in Protestant countries. I venture to think that philosophic Protestantism will compass a not dissimilar prosperity. Well, towards the end of his series, James turned to a more complete account of the pragmatic, or what we might call instrumental theory of truth. Like Nietzsche, James rejected out of hand the correspondence, or what he called copy theory of truth. Right? He gave a wonderful example. He said, well, look at this watch. Right? Look at the watch, now close your eyes and create your idea of it. And it will be a mental picture of it, which is more or less a copy of the appearance of the watch. So far, so good for copy theory. He says, now, think in your mind the idea of the watch's inner workings. Right? You all have an idea. And I would venture to say most of you have something pretty close to the right idea. But I would also venture to say not a one of you has anything even close to a copy of the watch's inner workings. Our ideas very rarely, in fact, our truths very rarely attempt to copy the world. They are rather, again, instruments in touching the world, getting a purchase on it, a cash value on it, turning it so that it fulfills our needs. James critiqued this copy theory of truth as static and inert. True ideas, according to this view, are sort of eternal copies you get, and when you get them, you're done. There's no more philosophic work to be done. Whereas James' view is, once you have a true idea, that's just the beginning of your process. You must now apply it to life. You must use it to create new situations, new contexts, change the world. They are everywhere instruments for actions. In fact, it is best not to think of sentences as being true so much as being made true by verification. And as James says, true ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true. It's made true by events. It's not an eternal fixed goal to which we move. I should point out that such verification needn't always be direct, right? Were I to say to you, it is snowing outside in Washington, D.C. right now, you would verify that by leaving this building and seeing if it is in fact snowing. But there are other claims that you cannot directly verify. If I was to say that it is snowing in Tokyo right now, I doubt many of you would get on the next jet. But you might look in a newspaper. You might turn on the Weather Channel. No direct verification, but indirect verification passes muster. In fact, most of our beliefs pass muster only through such indirect verification. Again, this is a point A.J. Ayer will make in his theory of meaning, and it will be considered a great breakthrough in some 30 years. So to recur to our major theme, true beliefs are instruments of action, not eternal copies of the world or thoughts in God's mind. And this, I would urge, is an extremely Darwinian view of culture. The true is simply the expedient in the way of belief, just as the good is the expedient in the way of action. Both are expedient, true or good, for specific and definite reasons. So if one wishes to respond to the pragmatist by saying, well, you keep saying that we should believe what's good, but what's good? You respond by saying that's not a meaningful question. Good for what? What's a good belief in terms of your physical health? Well, that would probably come down to medicine. What's a good belief in terms of psychological health? Perhaps psychoanalysis, perhaps religion. It would depend not only on the context, but on the person, on the situation, on the historical moment. There is no absolute truth, except, perhaps, conceived as a normative ideal that we might ultimately all believe in if we had free and open speech to last forever. Now that's a thought that Jürgen Habermas will spin about 3 or 4 books off in about 70 years and be considered a genius for. Well, James then turned in one of his last lectures to something he called pragmatism and humanism. And he opened it by recurring to this previous discussion of truth. What hardens the heart of everyone I approach with the view of truth sketched in my last lecture, the one I just expressed, is that typical, and here he alludes clearly to Bacon, idol of the tribe, the notion of the truth, which he spelled with a capital T, conceived as the one answer, determinate and complete, to the one fixed enigma which the world is believed to propound. James, in attacking that view, in saying that the truth is in fact simply what's expedient for us to believe, what's useful for us, what gives us a purchase on life, is in fact offering what he argues is a completely humanistic view of the cultural situation. The world's not a fixed given that we must correspond to, another idol of the tribe, but in fact is made over in our image as we parse it, as we work on it, right? Has not, in fact, our scientific theories changed the nature of the world. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. Certainly ozone holes might not have existed had it not been for some of our scientific breakthroughs, right? The amount of forest or tree land we might have had in our topography has changed dramatically because of changes in human culture. It is completely nonsensical for James to see, when one looks at this evolutionary dynamic process, to argue that the world is in some way fixed and final. It's constantly changing, and we're changing it. Also, the notion that the world makes our beliefs true when they're true, and we make them false when they're not, that our beliefs must agree with the world, somehow, James argues, is fixed on the metaphysical dogma that you can separate out the world's contributions to our beliefs from our contribution. As he, I think, quite nicely puts it, does the river make its banks, or does the banks make the river? Does a man walk with his right leg or with his left leg, more essentially? Just as impossible may it be to separate the real, right, the world's contribution from the human factors in the growth of our cognitive experience. Nietzsche used to describe that phenomena by saying our beliefs are human, all too human. James, I think, actually has the better phrase. What he says is, the trail of the human serpent is overall. That's a point which in recent years has been made by Donald Davidson to quite a bit of acclaim, quite rightly so. Well, the next point James makes really draws from his psychology. We have no awareness, he argues, of a world prior to our interpretation of it, at least under some of our descriptions or conceptual schemes. The pre-schematic phenomenal world one gets from Berkeley is itself an abstraction from experience. In and of itself, as observed in, say, the perception of an infant, the world is nothing but a booming, buzzing confusion, very much like Nietzsche's chaos. Now, so far, that's not entirely dissimilar to what Kant had said, if you'll remember in his Copernican Revolution. But what James points out is that none of those parsings are fixed in the human mind so much as evolve through the process of cultural change. By naming things and properties and attributes and relations, we break up the flux of experience, of sensation. We parse it. And most importantly of all, we humanize it, or make it serviceable for our human, biological, social, and psychological needs. That, of course, is a point that Martin Heidegger will make in about 30 years after the publication of this text, and will cause quite a stir. I wish to quote here, "We break the flux of sensible reality into things, then, at our will. We create the subjects of our true as well as of our false propositions. We create the predicates also. Many of the predicates of our things express only the relations of the things to us and to our feelings. Such predicates, of course, are human additions. Caesar crossed the Rubicon and was a menace to Rome's freedom. He's also an American schoolroom pest, made into one by the reaction of our schoolboys on his writings. The added predicate is as true of him as the earlier ones. He's just as much a pest to schoolboys in the early 20th century as he was a danger to Rome's freedom." And the point that James is making is, as I quote, "You see how naturally one comes to the humanistic principle. You can't weed out the human contribution." Well, Such a view of culture, then, is what I would argue dynamic, Darwinian, and evolutionary. Culture changes, or, if you would like, mutates, according to evolutionary dictates. Beliefs are called true only when they have a survival value for our species, or for our group, for our society. In a quite stirring passage, he says, "We plunge forward into the field of fresh experience with the belief our ancestors and we have already made. These determine what we notice. What we notice determines what we do. What we do again determines what we experience." So from one thing to another, although the stubborn fact remains that there is a sensible flux, what is true of it seems from first to last to be largely a matter of our own creation. Even our scientific truths are not written in God's pristine language. They are human language, which gives us a purchase, a hold, a cash value, and a lever, as it were, on the reality which surrounds us. And note, what do we call the vast bulk of those beliefs that we've inherited from ancestry? Common sense. So common sense, then, is nothing more than the fund of such previously effective beliefs and posits, for they're all posits. And this, of course, is a point that Ludwig Wittgenstein will make in his philosophical investigations, and it will bring him great fame, and rightly so. Finally, I want to return, or better yet, turn to James' defense of his version of perspectivalism and anti-realism against what he considered would be the imminent rationalistic criticism that, in fact, he did receive. He was quite prophetic on that. And see if this doesn't, in fact, correspond to what many of you may be feeling as an objection to this doctrine. Now, the idea of this loose universe affects your typical rationalist, and here I like to think of Kant or Hegel, in much the same way as freedom of the press might affect a veteran official in the Russian Bureau of Censorship. It affects him as the swarm of Protestant sects affects a papist onlooker. In other spheres of life, it's true that we've got used to living in a state of relative insecurity. The authority of the state and that of an absolute moral law have resolved themselves into expediencies. And Holy Church has resolved itself into meeting houses. Not so as yet within the philosophic classrooms. Right? James is arguing for a revolution in the way we think about philosophic problems. And it is a revolution which is both democratic, egalitarian, that there are as many solutions as there are tenable forms of life. And I want to illustrate that by recurring to that dilemma in philosophy. And the dilemma was that we want to have our facts and our hopes with them. As James says, rationalism sticks to logic and the empyrean. Empiricism sticks to the external senses. Pragmatism is willing to take anything, to follow either logic or the senses, and to count the humblest and most personal experiences. Her only test of probable truth is what works best in the way of leading us. If the notion of God in particular should prove to do it, how could pragmatism possibly deny God's existence? And this, I think, is a deep point. If the positive God helps an animal work its way through its environment and best cope with the struggles of its psychological nature, it would be insane to say that it doesn't exist. Rather, what pragmatism offers is a way to believe in that posit without doing violence to your intellectual conscience, without violating your sense of scientific realities. And here he says is the most profound misunderstanding of pragmatism. It's usually, as he argues, seen as positivistic tough-mindedness, right? As so much jabber and a love of intellectual anarchy. He says most people think pragmatists prefer a sort of wolf world, absolutely unpent and wild and without a master or a collar to any philosophic classroom product whatsoever. But in fact, James is saying that pragmatism is the mediator between your scientific rationality and your most profound psychological, moral, and spiritual needs. And that there are as many pragmatic solutions to any given problem as there are pragmatic thinkers. And finally, I want to conclude with this thought, that the pragmatic thinker that would be the ultimate pragmatic philosopher for James and for other pragmatists is not someone in a philosophy department, but the average person going about his average business in a rational and self-conscious fashion. It is, as it were, the philosophy of a democratic culture.